Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Asad Lalji. Welcome to another exciting live session of Avid Online. And for those who are joining us for the first time, a special welcome to you. Please refer to the chat box for more information on Avid Learning, the work that we do, and more information on our wonderful partners for this evening. We are very excited to enter our 8th month of online programming. And as many of you know, on April 1st, we introduced our digital further learning campaign, Avid Online, where we've curated and published a mix of live and Avid Online videos. And tonight, it marks our 134th program since April. We've covered topics and issues across the breadth of the arts and connected with the ever growing online community with a wide range of local, national, and even international speakers, truly bringing the best from around the world right to your screens and ensuring that even in these difficult times, we stay true to our mantra that learning never stops. This brings me to our evening session, which is the concluding part of the 4th edition of Sustainability Now, Conversations for a Greener Tomorrow, a week of programming dedicated to continuing and strengthening conversations around innovation, education, and shifting production and consumption patterns through the lens of food, architecture, agriculture, design, and heritage. I hope you've caught some of our fascinating videos that we've showcased on the subject so far, as well as our live session on last week on the future of food and agriculture in the new age, also presented under this umbrella. Tonight, the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangrahalaya, the CSMVS, and Avid Learning present Sustainability Now, the Eco Museum. At this point, I'd like to give a special applause to the CSMVS and their conscious effort and programming around sustainability within the museum space. In fact, did you know that the CSMVS is in Mumbai is probably the first museum in the world to be located in a heritage building in a heritage precinct and to achieve the highest platinum rating under the existing building category from the Indian Green Building Council for global leadership in environmental management. They've also published a wonderful film on the green agenda and the work that they've done. Please view the link, which has also been pasted in the chat section to view at your convenience later, and also some more information about the implementation and initiatives they have undertaken. I'd now like to give a warm virtual welcome to our panel of experts, principal designer and partner at Opolis, Rahul Gore, museum and cultural planner and founding partner, BRMA, Batul Raj Mehta, co-founder at the Bangalore Creative Circus and the Initiative for Climate Action, Ajay Raghavan, who will be in conversation with our moderator for this session, architect and educator, Carnegie Mellon University, Sarosh Anklesaria. For more about them and their very impressive bios, they have been posted in the chat section again, but have also been emailed to you earlier today. In today's session, our speakers will examine the rise and the relevance of the Ecological Museum, its evolving function and features, and in the larger sustainability agenda in museology today. Please note this session will last about 75 minutes, followed by a 15-minute Q&A in which Sarosh will be taking questions submitted by the audiences. So keep posting your questions in the Q&A box throughout the session. On that note, thank you once again for tuning in on this wonderful Saturday afternoon. Over to you, Sarosh, and look forward to a fascinating session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asad. Hello and welcome. I would like to begin our session on the Eco Museum with a few broad observations regarding the framing of ecology and the museum in India today. The existential threat of climate change is not an abstract notion. It is particularly visible and relevant in India when considering pervasive environmental degradation, air and water pollution, dying soils, dying rivers, and the extreme loss of non-human habitat and biodiversity. As Ramchandra Guha argues in How Much Should a Person Consume, the Indian ethos of ecology, as opposed to its imagination in the West, considered social constructs as entangled within the ecological. The notion of ecological justice is evident in the Chipko movement from the 70s, where the fate of the forest is conjoined with that of the people who depend on it for sustenance. The two cannot be divorced. Ecology is permanent economy, as Sundarlal Bahuguna put it. However, for wilderness movements in the West, the conception of the human was distinct from that of nature. The creation of the National Parks movement in the United States was predicated on purging Native American tribes from their land. By contrast, in India, successful environmental movements were people movements first. And this brings me to my second observation regarding the evolving role of the museum in India. As Saloni Mathur and Kavita Singh argue in their book, No Touching, No Spitting, No Praying, the birth of the museum in India was not driven by the same historical processes and democratizing impulses that threw open the doors of the Louvre to its citizenry, or offered a universalist survey of antiquities to the British metropolitan viewer. The museum's emergence in India was instead bound up in the politics of colonial patronage and the materialist acquisitionist needs of the great imperial knowledge production project. The years following independence, the museum became implicated in a task of nation building and modernity, reframing the colonial era view of museology and collections. There is a renewed interest in museums today. As Batul Raaj, one of our panelists, suggests, museums in India are finding new ways of embracing identities that respond to their own communities and histories, making the local visitor aware of the contributions of a particular period or region, establishing unique identities and serving local communities rather than a vague and amorphous audience of distant strangers. How then does the Eco Museum in India foreground the role of people as essential participants and stewards of ecological practices? How does it expand upon its collections to include forgotten histories of the subaltern and the dispossessed? How does it move beyond its framing as a vehicle for educating the masses to instead become a participatory project of empowerment for the community, blurring distinctions between high art and craft, considering new forms of viewership, display, and programming? Finally, what is the role of the museum and its architecture in valorizing practices of sustainable thinking? As building types, museums often have large carbon and energy footprints due to stringent temperature and humidity control requirements for the preservation of artifacts. How then might we consider renewable energies, low carbon footprints, circular thinking, material ecologies, labor practices to move beyond the notion of green rating systems? What strange, new, or hybrid typologies might we invent for the eco-museum of tomorrow to provide a new paradigm of ecological consciousness in an age of climate crisis? So we will divide our conversation today into four broad acts. We will begin with one of the most important and prominent museum projects in India today, the Bihar Museum. Two of our participants, two of our panelists, Batul Raaj and Rahul Gore, will speak about their long and close collaboration in the making of this museum, its complexities, contradictions, and lessons learned. The second act will consider the historical underpinnings of the museum and questions of patronage, from the governmental to private, citizen-driven initiatives. Our third act will consider inclusive and at times unconventional models that link social and ecological thinking. Ajay Raghavan will speak about his experiments, for instance, with the Bangalore Creative Circus, a new platform for circular material flows that connects artists with waste. Finally, we will attempt to expand the question of the eco-museum beyond green ratings and green buildings to ask broader questions about the role of museums in an age of climate crisis. So we will begin with with presentations by our panelists. And I would love to invite Batul Raaj to please begin hers. Thank you so much. And I must add that please feel free to drop questions into the Q&A part of the chat, and we're happy to take them at the end. Thank you again, and over to you, Batul.
Thank you, Sarosh. And thank you, Avid Learning, for putting this discussion and panel together. I'm just going to, as Sarosh has already spoken about some of the concepts that we are going to be discussing, what I'm going to be presenting is talking about the soft power and the sustenance of museums, along with what its position has been as has evolved during colonial period. Dhwani, can we have the presentation now, please? Thank you, Dhwani. So museums have been, especially in India, they have been modeled on the colonial structures. And while we have the Bihar Museum, and I'll leave Rahul to talk more about its architecture, we do see a lot of the vestiges in terms of institutional structures all around. And our attempt has also been in terms of sustaining the intangibles around our museums, which is whether it's context, whether it's heritage, whether it's memory, along with the green agenda that museums should be aspiring for. Next. So museums, many of you may know that a lot of the museums in India, especially the government museums, were all constructs of what had happened during colonial period. So they were for cataloging the entire empire as it was known, but also cabinets of curiosity, looking at political agendas, and that's how you had various institutions like ASI or census were taken. And you also had an economic agenda where the idea was that the Indian crafts would be sold overseas. And this is before the entire machine-made objects had become extremely cheap and available. So that's how the museum structure started. And museums in India, a lot of the old government museums have exactly the same cataloging systems as museums of the same period in London, whether you take the British Museum or the V&A. It's so closely linked. It's almost like having two shopping catalogs with the same number, so you could order easily. Next. So these are photographs of state museums or museums which you'll see any government museum where you've been dragged to from school. This is what you'll see. Beautiful objects, but no context, no idea about who were the makers, why, unless you read the labels or unless your teacher really drills it down. Next. But museums here, now in the last 10 to 15 years, we are seeing a change and a silent revolution happening in museums in bringing in more voices. And this photograph is of the Madhya Pradesh Tribal Museum, designed by the late Revati Kamath. Beautiful space. Everybody should be visiting it. The involvement of the local tribes in building their own stories is quite unique. Next. So if you see, traditionally, the museum's focus were collections, and to a small extent, the architecture started playing the role. But you did not pay attention to all the intangibles or like, how do you treat your visitors as just somebody who's going to walk through, or you treat them as audiences? Do you allow them to build their own stories through it? And do you want to just give dates and facts, or you want to create concepts? And we're seeing that entire shift coming in, where you can have multiple ideas related to a museum rather than just looking at something extremely beautiful and just walking through it and just forgetting what you saw. Next. So the Bihar Museum as an idea started in 2010, where we had developed the concept and the brief and I used to lead Lord Cultural Resources at that time. So it was part of that entire teamwork. But the interesting aspect of the Bihar Museum is that it did lead to a lot of inclusive voices and various kinds of sustainability. This, of course, is an inadvertent framing that has happened of a visitor thanks to the architecture and the backdrop it creates. Next. So the whole approach towards Bihar Museum wasn't just collection based, but it looked at a combination of architecture, of what would be the institutional plan, whether it would be the staffing, the business model, the market analysis, what's happening all around Patna, and with a lot of the understanding from an outsider's point of view, Patna was fairly nothing much was happening. But if one saw the entire place, Patna, looking at education levels, the understanding of people of their own history is very, very high and relevant, and they are completely involved in how it is being represented. And of course, the exhibitions and how the audience can be a part of it. Next. So our first step when we developed the brief for the architect was to look at the green agenda. Also because Griha had set a very obvious format for it, and we could look at how one could match it in terms of where collection needs would conflict with the Griha outlines, and that's why those would be the areas which could not be matched, but the other areas could work with it, and that's how we created this, and it went to the architects who will talk more about, and Rahul will talk more about how Maki and Opolis approach this entire. Next. But the other aspects of sustainability are, as I mentioned earlier, are more the intangible, the ones which talk about inclusiveness, about giving different voices to different groups. So if you see the oval picture which is there, or the faded picture, it's actually how most museums are. And when we started talking about voices, we did some literal voices where you had the horse talking about the Shersha Suri's Grand Trunk Road and how it was great even for animals, not just for humans. But we also looked at how children could interact and learn rather than reading anything or just being drilled down. And we looked at diasporas, like especially for Bihar, the Girmitya, and again, Amchandra Guha talks about it also. The entire, and Amitabh Ghosh talks a lot more, sorry. The entire aspect of the Bihari diaspora and how they were sold to and taken to colonies and never got back and saw their own motherland again, but how that has led to different cultures in society. And we dedicated one entire gallery to that, and we talk about that voice which is there, which is probably the first time that there has been a space for a diaspora of this kind in a museum. Next. Sustainability of crafts, as Sarosh mentioned earlier, that the whole concept of high art and craft, and we wanted to break that. So this is actually an example from another project that we did in Patna itself, where we explain the entire story of Buddha's life and enlightenment through various local crafts. So whether it's Sikhi craft or paper mache or terracotta panels, everything was done through using the local crafts, using local craftsmen only. The whole idea was that if you provide a space and a patronage to these crafts in the museum, then it will not be seen as something which is local, and that's why you take it for granted. And it has been appreciated, and it has weathered beautifully also. Next. This is an example of sustaining oral history, especially where it's not documented. This is not one of my projects, but it is a project which is one of my favorites. It's the Liberation War Museum in Dhaka, which has been set up by the freedom fighters. And they have been documented oral histories from villages, from freedom fighters, families, grandchildren, especially where they have not been able to. Because in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, also there have been instances based on where the government, the elected government, where they stand, that the histories are often taught differently in schools, and that's why this bunch of freedom fighters, they wanted to record history as they had seen it, and this museum is a brilliant example of that. It's a simple museum, but every piece has a story, and you usually have families of freedom fighters taking you around as volunteers, and you have this bus which goes from village to village talking about that history. So when you get in all these different angles of sustaining, whether it's voice, inclusiveness, whether it's bringing in sustainability, also in terms of your materiality and crafts, then what comes together as a museum is something which everybody can feel great about. It's not elitist. It is something which everybody can go and enjoy. And go to the next slide. So this is actually the cops are at the opening of the Bihar Museum, and they're probably on a VIP duty, and they just got really excited with what was happening, and you could see that they left their VIPs aside, and they were happy to take photographs and become a part of the exhibitions and enjoy it. And then you have these kids who were just measuring their arm spans against the wingspans of different birds, and they're understanding some things, not understanding some things, but they're taking away fun with them and some idea of what they saw, instead of just reading the wings, that a bird has a certain wingspan. So that's what we tried. We tried to bring in together that you could have the museum could give some agency to the audience of being involved and taking away memories that go beyond and do not have a top-down approach. So our whole idea of sustenance in this museum was about getting in the soft power, getting in people involved, getting in crafts, getting in what is usually not considered as high art, and that makes spaces completely elitist or white cubes. And it was our way of opening it up to audiences of all demographics and all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Batul. That was terrific. I would like to invite Rahul Gore, please. Rahul, to talk about the Bihar Museum.
Yeah. Hi, Sarosh. Thank you, Sarosh and Batul, for introducing the BR Museum already. I'm going to try and contextualize it so people who have not been to the BR Museum will get some visuals of it, so that I think when we have the panel discussion later, things get a little clearer and they have some images in front of them. So please start the presentation. So the Bihar Museum was a project done in collaboration between Opolis, that's our firm, and Markey and Associates. It's a Japanese architectural firm where we had deep roots, and where actually Sonal and myself, we had both worked there. Sonal is my partner at Opolis, and we had worked with Markey and Associates. So when this, when this project was announced, it was a competition. And this is how it sits currently. You'll see the Ganges River in the background, Patna city, and which is fairly low rise. And then this wonderful piece of 13.5 acre piece of land, which was along the main road of Patna called the Bailey Road. And that's how it sits. This is actually taken from the plane as it lands. So that's the view one gets when one is approaching Patna city. Next. So like I was mentioning, it was actually a competition in which Lord Cultural Resources played a big part, and I think Batul was heading it at that time. And they had set up a competition which looked at international architects, and Opolis teamed up with Markey and Associates to kind of win the competition and then successfully complete the project in a quick, short time frame of around 4.5 years. So I think one of the critical aspects in the design was this kind of timeless quality, and I'll quote Mr. Markey here, where he says that the museum building must be appreciated by not only the client and its users, but also by the general public. So in this sense, the building must be timeless, because time will be the final judge of the building. And I think while keeping the design of this building in mind, that was one of the kind of critical factors. And time has got to do with sustainability. You know, anything that can last long, it already has a sustainable feature built into it. This building has achieved the 5-star GRIA rating. For people who are not familiar with ratings, GRIA is the Indian equivalent of the LEED rating, which is a more internationally accepted one. And in fact, GRIA goes beyond LEED, I think, in many ways, primarily because they give right now only a provisional 5-star rating like what you see. And they give a full rating only 2 years after completion of the building, when it has been monitored and they really check the design parameters to see if a building is completed to the standards it was built. And I think that's completely brilliant in the way GRIA approaches the building. Yeah, next. So that's how the building sits within the city. It was an intention to treat it like a campus and not like a building. So hence the approach was a collection of buildings that make up a larger urban fabric. And like in all cities, however well you plan the front of the museum, Indian museums are going to be this way. So I think the idea of locating the entrance away from its two very dense nodes on either side was a very important urban design gesture in ensuring that the city did not suffer once this came up in terms of just traffic and management of the way the city works. So I think that has an inbuilt feature which is very important at the urban level. Next. That's the entrance canopy and the entrance plaza where people come in. It has to be designed to take in large volumes of people. This museum is already seeing footfalls in the range of 3,000 to 4,000 people daily. And it seems on New Year's Eve and Diwali, not in this year, but last year, they had around 10,000 people visiting it in a single day. Next. So once you enter the canopy and you come into the museum, it's on axis with a water body. And that's, I think, again, the calming feature. And this lobby design is very important. It connects to the Children's Museum on one side, the main museum galleries on the other. At the same time, it needs to kind of relate, get people down and calm them. So it has to work for a few people at times, and sometimes there are like hundreds of people in here. So it's important for the scale of the space to make everybody feel comfortable, slow them down so that they can enjoy the museum experience. Next. This is a view looking towards the main museums. It's the same entrance lobby space where you see the entrance on the left-hand side and a cafe on the right-hand side with the wooden doors. And that's the way to the main museum. The control of light, natural daylight was one of the key features that we played with to ensure even in the harsh summer light, the kind of space, the quality of light is controlled. Go on. A big component of the museum is the children's gallery, and this is a view from the landscape outside, looking at the children's drum, which was essentially seen as a kind of a space which opened out to the landscape for the children. At the same time, it was introverted in the way it functioned as a space, being a circle, and it had a natural light coat in the center. Go on, next. And that's actually the children's gallery that Batul showed earlier, which has a beautiful central court, which brings an ample daylight. And this place is designed for children to kind of come in, experience all the artifacts, and it's been done by Lord Cultural Resources, the design of it. Go on, next. So what's unique in this museum, I think, and contextualizes it very much to India, is the use of courtyards. This museum has 7 courtyards, all of different shapes, varying sizes, using different materials, having different finishes on the flooring, and each one serves a specific purpose. So this is the Amphitheatre Quartet, which is kind of the non-ticketed zone and is open to people even beyond museum hours in the evening. It could be for events, it could be for functions. And the idea that this is a loosely held space with its presence of the administrative building was critical to the design of the entire museum. Go on, next. So while the museum, the galleries themselves are all black boxes, one moves around them you can move through the gallery space, or there's this alternative route, or what we call the Cloister Space, And again, the modulation of the daylight, the reference to daylight at any point of time so that people, it helps to orient themselves and to be able to scale the people's movement as they go from one gallery to the other. So this was a very important kind of connecting architecture to the museum. And it has a large, what we like to call the lounge space, which has a sculpture installation by a very prominent Bihari artist. And it's flooded with daylights. It's a triple volume. And this is actually the pause place where you can pause between going visiting galleries, but it also has a very grand staircase that connects to the upper level. And it's flooded with natural light. Yeah. Like I mentioned, the galleries themselves, these are galleries, these pictures are taken slightly before they were completely done. This was at the inauguration time. But the galleries are black boxes. And here you'll see one of the most prominent sculptures, the Yakshi, which has been set up. And on the left is the traditional local art from Bihar. But these exhibition spaces were black boxes, and that made it all the more important for those cloister spaces to be able to orient people around. Go on next. And then this image you see is actually the exhibition courtyard, which is part of the exhibition sequence. It has galleries all around. You'll see the small openings, which are constantly openings that modulate light as one moves from gallery to gallery. And this space has been visualized as completely a white space. So there's a white sandstone, there is white marble grit on the flooring. And this contrasts with the other landscape courts, which are either green or they're surrounded by black granite. So kind of giving each character to each courtyard. And like I mentioned, each of these courtyards is very critical to making this a very kind of a space rooted to India, because it gives the quality of light that comes into all the other spaces is controlled from here. Each of these courtyards also has different sound levels, by the way, depending on the way it is enclosed. And Patna is a very noisy city. So this one's a very calm courtyard simply because it has huge masses of the galleries on all sides. Yeah, so that's, thank you. So I think we'll take on more issues on how this project was structured, because I think it has a very successful model. One state could do it through an international procurement process and finish it within a very tight time frame and on very much on budgets. This project was finished with a variation of 2% on the overall project cost. So these are stencils that we hope other governments can use, other states can use, and it's something that we need to push with the bureaucrats within our country to use this kind of a stencil and a model that has been developed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rahul. I'd like to invite our third panelist, Ajay Raghavan, to please make his presentation.
Thanks, Sarosh. Vani, can you put the slides up? Hi, and good evening. It's a little bit of a tough act to follow, just sort of two incredible sort of conversations. I must say, super impressed by the Bihar Museum. I'm seeing it for the first time, and it sounds fascinating. I also feel a little bit like a misfit because we've got three architects here, and I'm a lawyer by background. My conversation today is really going to be around sustainability and in a slightly different sort of manner. Can we move the slide? So I'm just going to start by sort of talking about why sustainability, and I'm also going to try and define what sustainability and contextualize it in terms of what I mean by sustainability. I think the best science on the planet today and the best scientists on the planet today are telling us that the amount of carbon that we're currently releasing into the atmosphere is heating the atmosphere up today so significantly that the climate or the sort of climate patterns that we've had for years are likely to be disrupted and change in a really short period of time. The IPCC report, which is essentially a really interesting document, it took about 224 scientists 3 years of sort of time of working on over 6,000 publications and sort of reviewing that. And then it was sort of then passed on to a bunch of larger reviewers across the planet. I think about 42,000 sort of comments came in. And then at the end of that exercise in October of 2013, just a fabulous of scientific journal came out explaining what is likely to happen to the planet if the temperature of the planet essentially moves up to 1.5 degrees. It also goes on to talk about when we'll of achieve that number. What's interesting is just from a more basic perspective, the idea of the planet warming is based on the fact that we're releasing gases into the planet at a rate that we've never released them before, largely of carbon and a couple of other of gases. And in the last 60 years, we have almost doubled the amount of carbon that we have released into the planet. So for a couple of million years, we had about 280 or 250 parts per million of carbon that has remained constant in the planet, therefore giving us pretty much the of regular cycles and predictability that we have today. And literally in 60 years, we have of changed that. We've gone up. Today, we're at about 415 parts per of million of carbon that's sitting in the atmosphere. And carbon, as many of you all know, is a heat trapping gas. So essentially, we're trapping lots of heat in the atmosphere, and that's leading to a bunch of things that that are actually occurring today. So this report essentially says that we're going to hit this number of 1.5 degrees, which is essentially the entire planet is going to increase its temperature by 1.5 degrees in a period of 9 years from today. And what it also means, it talks about in that 9 years, what's likely to happen to the planet. It talks about extreme of weather event. It talks about the impact on agriculture, talks about significant impacts on cities. The Arctic ice is likely to melt far more. And it's quite incredible because it took us 60 years for the first 1 degree. It's taking us 10 years for the next 0.5 degrees. And that's going to be accelerated as we move forward. So just from that context, what we're doing today to the planet is quite worrisome. And if you broke that down and try to understand where this carbon is coming on, it essentially, if you look at cities, today about 55% of the global population resides in cities. They're saying that in the next by 2050, that number is likely to go up to almost 70%. So we've got 70% of our planet that's likely to live in smaller spaces, which essentially are cities. We've also got data which says that about 75% of all of the global gases that are being released are on account of cities. And then finally, where these studies are telling us that at the end of this, about 70% of all cities on the planet are going to be significantly affected in the next couple of years on account of what's happening with of the climate. Just moving to the next slide. So if you broke this down, what we've also seen is, given that cities are so significant in what they do in terms of global warming, if you break that number down, you're able to see that about 75% of all carbon emissions on the planet are coming from transport and buildings in cities. So at least about 3/4 of all of the gases that are being sent out into the planet are coming from these two sources. And if you just broke that down into buildings specifically, about 1/3 of all greenhouse gases on the planet are coming on account of the way we are using buildings. The 40% of all energy on the planet consumed is on account of buildings. 25% of all of the water on the planet is being consumed by buildings. And about 40% of all the material that today we produce and consume is on account or going into buildings. So as you can see, the impact that buildings have on of the planet and the way that the planet is resilient and functions is very, very significant. The next slide. Just so what does this mean? This also means that because the climate is changing, and we're saying that in the next 10 years, we're going to have extreme weather patterns and changes in everything we do. They've also mapped out of information to say that some of the fastest growing cities on the planet are also the most vulnerable to the impact of climate change. And if you look at it, all 4 of our most significant cities are part of this. They're saying that Mumbai, for instance, is very, very high. It's, I think, in the top 4 or 5 in terms of vulnerability to floods. It's of New Delhi. We've already seen what's happened in Calcutta and in in Chennai as well. You can see in Kerala, we've had floods. In Uttarakhand, we're sort of having extreme events. Assam's having it. So very clearly, it's already playing out today. We haven't even reached that sort of threshold of the next couple of 9 years. And things at an extreme level are happening. So what essentially is the point around all of this is that our cities today are terribly vulnerable to the potential impact of climate change, both from an adaptation as well as how we can sort of mitigate that. Just moving to the next slide. And therefore, what can we do about this? I think the solutions, and this is the interesting one, my own journey as sort of somebody who's tried to understand the sustainability space. I started by imagining that these solutions don't exist. We can't do anything about this. But what's amazing and what's sort of what I've learned is that the answers to pretty much all of the problems we have today that we're talking about in sort of as far as climate change or sort of global warming is concerned already exist. I mean, we can literally sort of take a city, and if we applied a certain way of responding to the sort of climate crisis, we can create cities that are far more resilient, that consume and sort of send out a lot less carbon. And this is by sort of just building more intelligently, by sort of having better mobility, sort of better urban planning sort of systems, better waste management, better water management. All of this is technology that does exist today. And yet, as most cities of the world, we haven't really embraced this and started to use this. If we move to the next slide. Which finally brings me to just what we're trying to do. So Bangalore Creative Circus is essentially, it's a physical platform. It's an actual space where we're trying to sort of draw attention to people about the idea of climate change and getting them to sort of then respond to that by living more sustainably, by demonstrating the various sort of solutions around sustainability. It's about 20,000 square feet. It's meant to sort of demonstrate all of the solutions that already exist, and so hopefully through that get more people to actually sort of start to use them. The initiative for climate action, which is another sort of thing that I'm part of, essentially is the idea of the group is how can we bring lots of people who are interested in sustainability together to a common platform to really sort of work on research, on policy, on government intervention in really sort of creating systems, and that's really what the ICA is about. Just moving to the last slide, and why I guess I'm here, is the fact that one of the things that we're trying to do through Bangalore Creative Circus is really try and sort of almost create the notion of a museum where people can come in, get awareness, starting with sort of awareness, and then also sort of understanding what solutions exist. This is around air, water, food systems, energy, waste, mobility, construction, and things that are linked, ecology and well-being. And the idea is by creating a common platform where all of these things are there, you're able to see this holistically, and we're able to then work on city level impact. So that's sort of the basis of this. Thanks, I'm going to end with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ajay. That was incredible. So thank you all of our panelists for those fantastic presentations. And I'd like to start with sort of going back to this question of the museum in India in the contemporary setting. Maybe Rahul and Batul, because we know you collaborated on this museum and you collaborated on it from different ends. Rahul, you're working from an as an architect, from the architectural side, and then Batul, you framed through Lodge, you pretty much framed and programmed this museum. Could you talk about that collaboration? Because I think that is important to understand in terms of like all the work that goes into putting a museum together, a world-class museum together, is really quite significant. And somehow by unpacking this collaborative effort, maybe we can touch upon questions of sustainability, normative. Rahul, you spoke about normative common sense practices like courtyards that go into making this project, which sort of make a lot of sense in our kind of climate. But Batul, you also spoke about the programming of the museum to include children, the kind of inclusive aspect of the museum. And so I think that embedded in this, if I go back to my sort of first conceit of the fact that ecology is intertwined with social questions, then it would be really good to hear a little more about the collaboration and all the work that sort of happens behind the scenes when you put together a project like this. So maybe start with Batul.
Thanks, Sarosh. Sarosh, you framed it very well already. So yes, the programming was pretty important, and we had built a very, very detailed brief for the competition in which Maki and Opolis together won the competition. But yes, as far as the programming was concerned, the brief that we had got from the client was that here's a collection and build something which is world class. And if you work with any government projects in the last 20 years, world class is a term which every project uses. It's world class, iconic, or unique. So we had to define it for ourselves that, when we talk about world class, it has to be something which is relevant to its immediate neighborhood, to the people who are going to be its primary audiences. And then if it's good for that, then it will sustain on the site, and then automatically it will sustain for everybody else around. So when we began with the programming effort in terms of developing the brief, while we spent some time in understanding the history and the artifacts and the collections, and Bihar, as many people may know, it is almost like the history that's taught in our schools of India starts in Bihar, because you have Buddhism, Jainism, Ashoka, all the big guys happen there. And the history of archaeological survey of India also happens in Bihar, because Nalanda is one of the biggest excavations.
Sure.
But after that, and what has happened, people do not combine the two. Like when you think of Bihar in the 90s, you do not think of these histories. You do not see. And one of the briefs that we had got from the Chief Minister, Nitish Kumar ji, at that time was about how can this museum again be showcase the pride of Bihar, and which is a soft power that most of us working on museums are aware of. And that's why when we decided to look at history, we also decided to look at groups which are usually not given that agencies in museums. So that's why we had a children's section where we developed ideas, spending time with kids in a hobby center, which is for slum kids. So we just to get an idea of what they would get excited from. We wanted to get in crafts, so we decided to have a regional art gallery which would have new crafts commissioned from local crafts. We wanted to get in the diaspora, as I said, that when the Girmityas, and by the way, the Girmitya, the term comes from agreement, but during the colonial periods, they were illiterate and they had no clue what they were putting their thumb on, but they only had that agreement, and that's why the Girmityas were extremely, extremely disenfranchised groups in society, even those days. And that's why having their voice in a museum wasn't heard of. At the most, you had some kind of miniature paintings which would show a ship, and then that's it. So we wanted to get in all these aspects, but we also wanted to make it relevant for people today who are in Patna, the normal educated class, or people who are aspiring to go beyond what their backgrounds are. And that's why we included a lot of programmable spaces, like Rahul has spoken and shown some of the courtyards, but whether it's multi-purpose halls, whether it's including an amphitheater or creating an auditorium where and cafes, so that you can have that life and that vibrancy in the museum. And we also looked at a program calendar which built in festivals and all the various aspects. And all of that got together, and that became the brief which went to the competition, to the final 5 shortlisted, out of which the response and the design which Maki Opolis had developed was the most appreciated one, and that's how they eventually went on to build the museum. I have to give them credit for the fact that it's one of the fastest built museums of this scale in the world, and it's in Bihar. The biggest credit, of course, goes to the government clients, whether it was the nodal officer who was the chief secretary at that point, Anjani Kumar Singh, or the building construction department principal secretary. All of them were extremely involved in the project, and we had approvals happening based on understanding rather than approving for the sake of approving. And all of that together meant also the middle level teams from the government were aware of every drawing. They'd gone through everything. They knew how integration was happening. So nobody was passing the buck or pushing the paper. They were actually spending time understanding what was happening. And that's how you had this project with everybody coming together, and it was a multicultural team, because Lord Cultural Resources, as most of you know, is based in Canada. So it had some Canadians, lots of Indians. Maki Opolis is a Japanese and an Indian team. And then eventually we had a fabricator who was Singapore-based, and of course the entire Indian and the Bihari groups right there. So multicultural, multilingual, but everybody trying to do their best, and all of that came together.
Which is increasingly the case when you put together museums like of this scale. You do work across all kinds of teams. Rahul, just to follow up on that, as an architect, how do you sort of make sense of a world-class museum that actually starts with privileging communities? So that's one question related to programming. But on the other hand, I also want to bring you into the kind of difficult problems of sustainability when it comes to museums, because of course museums are very intense consumers of energy. You need to have galleries that are air conditioned. You need to have HVAC systems. How do you reconcile these aspects of the kind of hard technological questions? And also, if you could share with us, if you were to do this again, which I'm sure you will at some point, what are the lessons learned?
Sure. Well, that's a lot of information in there for me to respond to. But I think I'll just take your point. I think we started off with this idea of collaborations. And I think this museum was essentially the collaborations at various levels. And I think when we step back and we look, how do you make a successful project? Because we've, besides this, we've participated in around another 3 or 4 competitions which we've actually won, but they haven't got translated to projects. And so, as a practitioner, we're always seeing and obviously that something gets done means it's sustainable because it works, and that's when it gets done. So what does it take to make a project successful? I think that's very important. And Batul stressed a lot on the brief. I think that's the primary thing, that a brief is of course very important. What I think even what's more important than that is the persons at the top, or a person who's backing the project, really having the conviction in the processes they have followed and set up. So they've chosen Lord as a master planner, then Lord set up a thing to choose the architects for the project. And believe me, a project like this, it can fall apart. There are thousands of instances when it can just fall apart. And it's at that stages where the person who has set up the very practices and chosen the people, if they have conviction in the process they followed, a project will be successful. And I think this project showed that way. And Batul mentioned the nodal officer, Anjani Kumar Singh, who kind of really anchored the project, made sure that obstacles were cleared. And he had the vision that, okay, we have followed this, we will trust our consultants, they will do the right thing. Because there are literally hundreds of occasions on which a project such as this can slip through. And we face this on other competitions we won, where the same process they'll follow, they'll select the architect, and then there is some public outcry, and suddenly it's made to look like, oh wow, it's easier to just change over, and things fall apart. So I think to see a project through is the very important part. And to that, I give full credit to Lord Cultural for having set up this, and to the clients, like I mentioned, who have had the conviction to go through with it. So the brief is important, and a client who has a conviction to follow that. I think if we can do these two things, we can, in India, we can have an amazing landscape of museums, and not only museums, public buildings, because I think all public buildings go through a similar procurement process. And I think that's the key. And, in the long run, if you realize doing something like that is so much more, I mean, I will call it sustainable, because it's not money wasted. It's money put in the right place, it's thought out, and it gives its fruits. Otherwise, you end up seeing so much of money just going down the drain, right? So from that perspective, I think it's very important. And it's a good model, it's a good stencil to follow. That's one. Yeah, of course, the challenges of making a museum is tremendous. But I think, India and following best practices, following common sense, India has had great architecture through the history, and it's been far more sustainable than any of the market-driven kind of practices which take place today. So it's actually, if one looks back and then moves ahead, is the best way to do any museum. And I think in our project, we try to look at that, look at the solidity of the building, look at the light quality, control it, of course, get your basics right of orienting it in the correct direction, minimizing glass. One of the key factors from the competition scheme to by the time we get built, in terms of design, there is less than a 2% to 3% variation. But what has changed really was we cut down on the amount of glass. And this is something, as Mr. Maki, when he came here, we really observed buildings. One is we could never get a good glass facade in India. That itself is a big question. But more importantly, one sees that glass is not the correct material to build in the long run. And how can one alternate and actually control that process? So I think just following common sense things are very important. So passive design is very important. But besides that, of course, all the active components like, putting solar panels on the roof, conserving water, making sure that all the buildings well insulated, making sure that every glass is shaded and it's not exposed. All these kind of active strategies, of course, used. And, engineering wise, I think it's nothing great. And I think every building is now engineered in such a way that it should be sustainable. It's a given. Right. And museums, yes, because they're high in demand. But I think what we are creating is a cultural capital. And what cultural capital does is it has to stand the test of time. And to stand the test of time, a building has to be durable. So I think it's very important not to give the market-driven sustainability overriding importance to actually the cultural heart of the project. That's more important. And I think that sustains in the long run. And I think that's an experience of someone like Mr. Maki, who's now 93 years old. So he's seen, generations of architects and architecture and gone through the processes, and one can distill and come out and point out, this is what is important for a museum. And in the Indian context, this is what needs to be done. So I hope I've been able to kind of...
no, thank you. That's really useful. Thank you. So I think this is also interesting because you mentioned the role of the government so much, and the fact that actually the government managed to make it happen, which somehow, surprises us. And I think that this also ties into the question of patronage, because museums being so capital intensive in the kind of commercial and normative scheme of things, you never get your return on investment back. That is not why you make a museum. You make a museum because, as you said, it is a cultural artifact, and there is a cultural capital to it, which cannot be measured in terms of monetary values alone. But that does raise the question of patronage, because increasingly large amounts of capital means that either governments have to be involved or very massive corporations have to be involved. And to bring Ajay into this conversation, Ajay, what is so fantastic about what you're doing is that it's a different model. You're not the government, and you're not a major corporate power, and you're producing a museum of your own. So perhaps tell us a little bit about the kind of alternative structure of the Bangalore Creative Circus, and how do you think that it could potentially be a model?
Sure. Thanks, Sarosh. I think just maybe just starting with the space itself, and maybe I'll just quickly talk through that. So the space itself was used to be an old, dilapidated sort of warehouse that was being used for tiles when I got it. And what we did was we started to sort of dig the space up, and as we dug the space, we started to sort of find that actually there was an old factory, a steel factory that used to use it, and they had essentially taken a lot of the rubble that they had and buried it literally under the ground and put concrete over the whole thing. So as we started to dig up the space, because we wanted to demonstrate sort of biodiversity, ecology, sort of food systems, we suddenly came across sort of stones and bricks and all of that. And a significant part of that was actually used to reconstruct parts of the space. So the office block actually came out of what was within the sort of literally under the ground already. And most of the other sort of parts of the space are actually sort of created with, interestingly enough, sort of material that my old law firm sort of was getting rid of when they sort of shut down the office or was sort of moving to a new office. About 3 floors of from cabins to sort of the entire terrace space. All of this essentially was reused to construct. So part of it was also to demonstrate the idea that any material can potentially be used and there's no such thing as waste. And you can actually, so about 80% of the entire space is currently rebuilt completely out of recycled material. But I think more in sort of importantly, just in terms of the question you've sort of raised, which is how can a space like this become, I mean, it's a slightly different imagination of what a museum is. But the intention here is really to say, how can we draw anyone who's interested in the idea of sustainability, but more importantly, also those who are not, into the experience so that we can sort of bring them in and then get them to almost sort of feel joy in the idea that you can live more efficiently. So that's sort of the framework. We're using art as pretty much a framework to do it. Where we've got a whole bunch of, so part of the imagination is also to say, how can we allow the art community to thrive within the city? Because it is very, very difficult in Bangalore for artists to sort of, there aren't enough sort of instances of spaces where artists can actually go and do things. So part of it was to say, how can we literally sort of get these two things to work together? So the artist is essentially creating the visual of the space, which is sort of quite dramatic in its sort of visual with the art. But essentially, it's a tool to draw people into the experience. And then there's an entire sort of journey of information around sort of things around sustainability, whether that's food systems, whether that's a sort of mobility, energy, everything that a city needs. And we're starting with information and then moving into the idea of actual solutions. So part of how we're hoping to financially keep this, because just the idea of having a museum, like you're saying, if you don't have patronage, if you don't have the government sort of funds to do it, for me to a large extent, this is out of personal funds. So the idea is to say that how can we not just sort of demonstrate this, but also get people to access it. And therefore sort of bringing in service providers. The whole idea of this space is essentially to be a collaborative space, saying that how can we draw all of this wonderful energy that already exists around sustainability, whether that's architecture or sort of people working in the business side or sort of for justice or social enterprise or all of these things, bring them together on a platform and then get people to really sort of then bring this museum alive in a way that all of us can do it collectively. So that's sort of the imagination. Hopefully the little things we're doing, including trying to have a cafe, sort of trying to do sort of sell our own produce, trying to sort of demonstrate things, use an event space. All of this will be able to keep this financially sustainable in the long run. But we'll only know it's opening to the public in the next month. We'll know from there how it goes.
Best of luck with that. That sounds really ambitious. But I think what really struck me as you were talking and as you were presenting the BCC was that it is really a different model also of participatory politics, right? So the fact that you engage with people in a much more direct way, you are actually the distinction between the art object and the participant is completely blurred. And there is a much more visceral sort of awareness of processes, especially when you work with waste, when you involve artists, you involve community, and when you work with ecological, environmental questions of sustainable food production, or water or waste. And so it's a kind of direct address of ecological questions on the one hand, but through educative participatory processes. And this brings me into a question that I would like to open up to all of you, which is, what is the role of the museum in promoting ecological literacy, in framing questions of ecology? I mean, we also have so many museums in India today where footfalls are really quite abysmal, even today. You know, I was reading recently that there were 800 people who go to the City Museum in Ahmedabad, designed by Le Corbusier. Most of them are school children per month. So you know, speaking of 4,000 people per day at the Bihar Museum is really quite something. But this is really a question of, therefore, both participatory agendas and ecological agendas. And the question is, how does that really happen? How do you frame ecological literacy for the museum today? So any one of you, please.
Yeah, I'll butt in and say, students and kids today are so smart. I mean, and they've been schools and academic curriculums are really pushing the environmental aspects. So I think the challenge for museums is to live up to the expectations, because they already have that information and they are very aware now that what it means to be sensible in the way we build and how do we conserve water. So I think one cannot, one has a responsibility to that next generation in making sure that the buildings live up to what they're learning. And these, in a way, and this is where the patronage and the role of the government comes in. If a government building can do that, if it's a museum, not that it cannot be a private, but if a government building can do that, it'll really push the envelope and get everybody to really think ahead. So I think it's more actually a responsibility for us, more than teaching them, is to live up to the expectations. And that's going to be the critical factor.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. Just to add, I think from well, I think the point you made about sort of young people, I think that especially in the sustainability and climate space, given what it means to them in the coming years, I feel like there's a much greater sort of both awareness as well as ambition to understand this better, and actually sort of I think even the choices that young people make are today very different from the choices that some of us made years back. And I think they start to respond to any space, especially in the public context or in any space they're going to. I feel like there's a much greater awareness and also sort of expectation that people are sort of doing things in a certain sort of manner. Sarosh, on your point of how to sort of make these centers, I believe at some level, if you can make ownership of these spaces community driven, which is to really involve the community and get people to say that this is a really important learning space for all of us, and we can greatly benefit from it if we can activate these spaces in a certain way by and I guess if museums were more inclusive in that sense and were more accessible to different types of people, but also more engaging, not just, you don't just sort of come and observe. If you can actually interact with things, I think that will start to build a certain type of I guess need for people to actually visit these spaces and sort of do things. So it just sounds to me like if museums could become more sort of spaces that are owned by, where people felt more ownership about the space, there's a higher chance that people would want to visit it and then sort of interact with it.
Batul, you have some fascinating insights about inclusivity, and you spoke about also slum children being involved with Bihar, but I know from talking to you previously, Batul, that you really are able to tease out inclusivity, which is unique in certain ways and actually quite under the radar. I don't think a lot of people know about some of the initiatives that museums are taking already to promote this. So please do talk about it.
So thanks, Sarosh. So I'll go back to what you just mentioned, that it is to a great extent about participative politics or engagement. And as Ajay said, that it cannot be that somebody who comes is just a visitor in the sense that they are just completely passive when they go through. So that engagement is necessary, but it also means that allowing a person to understand multiple facets. And then they start seeing themselves as part of that history, that science, that maths, whatever the museum is talking about. So, and Ajay again mentioned about communities and communities taking over the museum. And this is something we have been recommending for smaller museums, whether they're private museums or they're museums which cater to a certain neighborhood. And we had advocated in the past for some of these museums that you should allow a community to come and take over a space every month. And it can be as simple as them just feeding the food that they cook in homes to the museum visitor. But it can be a lot more. It can be their own worldviews, it can be their traditions, their dance, their music. And it just allows people to be more comfortable around people who are different, which we see is not happening, and you want that to happen. But it also gives voice to a lot of groups which do not feel that they are part of the whether it's the social fabric or who believe they're disenfranchised. And for one of our museums which we were working with, is again a small museum in Kochi, we had recommended that they get in this group called Avani, which would be looking at getting transgenders and the LGBTQA community to come and paint the walls of the museum and create murals. And that entire process of that happening in the public eye, not about just getting in an artwork and placing it, would mean that you open up people to conversations. Of course, there'll be some people who will not be happy with it, but you start bringing in those conversations and you get people to sit up and take notice about these things. And there's so many groups, and if all these groups and their ways of just having that conversation of having multiple facets to history. We just now, a lot of people believe that history is just one dimensional, and that's what they learn from, whether it's WhatsApp or whether it's their Google searches or YouTube videos, is the only history. And like we say about truth, that there are many sides to truth, and the same thing, there are many sides to history. And if a museum allows people to talk about various versions, and people will open up to the fact that reality can have many facets, and it would just make our society a little bit more tolerant of everything else. So
thank you for that.
Bring in that in our museums in whatever way. We do not do it in a very overt manner, because one doesn't want to have people believe that it's a contrarian space, but one does want to sensitize people to understand that there are many facets to how things can be done. And that's why slum kids and their participation on how they would like to see the museum, because if you can get them to the museum and make them feel comfortable, you're going to have a lot more interesting conversations and thought processes coming out from there for everybody.
I really loved the Liberation War Museum in Dhaka, and when you see it, that it is not something that is a vestige of a colonial past, that it is something that literally comes out of the soil of Dhaka, and that it is inherently people driven. And I love this notion that history is not one single narrative, but really it is multiple narratives. And more so, I would also argue that so many histories have been not written, have been suppressed. And so the museum as a space for the subaltern, for valorizing histories that that are less visible. All of these things make it, one could argue, different from, say, a community center alone, right? That's one of the role of that museums have. They are in some sense also custodians of artifacts and of histories, but they have the capacity to narrate and re-narrate, retell stories. So in that sense, it does become, again, a place for participatory politics. And maybe the question then is one of connecting it back to questions of ecology, given the Eco Museum, given that we're focused on the Eco Museum. And here, Ajay, I'm interested in what your initiatives are with the ICA, and how do you think that would plug into not only the museum, but of course the larger question of, as you said so pointedly in your presentation, about the role of climate change in cities in India, and related that to buildings, of course, because I think that's somehow there's a sense that green buildings alone are not going to save us. That we need to do we need a much more political and also immersed engagement with questions of ecology. So I would love to hear a little bit more about the ICA in that regard.
Sure, thanks. So the ICA, essentially the idea of the initiative for climate action is to say that there is so many different people, I think, today who definitely understand the science, B, want to do something about it, and they come from a really sort of diverse set of backgrounds. The idea being, how can we channelize all of that energy together, and how can we bring sort of people together to really sort of create a framework where we can all go into our respective spaces and start to create impact. So for instance, the ICA today is about, in about 6 months, we're about 35 people who plugged in. And it's a really diverse group of we've got lawyers in there, we've got climate scientists in there, we've got architects in there, we've got design professionals in there. And the idea is we're all sort of coming into it from the perspective of saying that I know how my respective sort of space works, I know how the law works, I know how law firms work, I know how litigation works, but also to contextualize and say, how can I take the idea of what climate change is and how sort of resilience at a city level sort of works, and take that and really start to use it effectively to influence my sphere of space. And at some level, the imagination is to say, how can we build a model for the right sort of way to reach that part of transition, and to recognize that there are so many different stakeholders in our ability to actually allow for that to happen. If the government is not sort of doesn't see value in it, if the bureaucracy doesn't see value in it, if businesses don't see value in it, if the citizen doesn't see value in it, I think that all of these are such critical stakeholders in our ability to actually create city level transformation, that if we don't take these voices and don't take them along in this journey, we're unlikely to really be able to, in an accelerated way, try and sort of create any sort of impact using these tools that already exist. So part of it is really to say, how can we bring all of this energy together and then work collectively? So to a large extent, it starts by localizing knowledge. I think if we can take science that today unfortunately exists in these 200-page sort of research papers, how can you make that really simple for people to understand in a way that they understand the impact that it has on them, and what they can do with it, more importantly. So that's really part of the effort, to say that how can we make information really accessible in a way that people can quickly not just understand it, but actually do something about it.
Which is the role, again, of museums, and also the role of museology, which is to unravel and make visible that which is sometimes too dense to access. So it somehow ties back to a question of museology and museums. But I want to bring Batul and Rahul in on this. How do we go beyond ratings, Griha ratings, LEED ratings? How do we go beyond ratings and sort of greenwashing and a kind of jargon that has been invented around sustainability, smart cities? And there's a lot of jargon here. And the question is, how do we move beyond that toward new paradigms of ecological consciousness? Either one of you.
Rahul, you can go first.
Okay, so I think it's very correct. It's green has become the current fashionable jargon to use, and it's the market that drives it. And we were actually looking at sustainability way back in 2003 when I was looking at sustainable cities for an international competition that we had by the World Gas Conference, and it's very clear that what we continue to need to do is to have security for water, for energy, and for food. And it is just these three parameters that actually drive complete sustainability. And it's a market that kind of catches up and moves around these three things. But I think to me as an architect and as an individual, it's more important to go beyond by touching the heart. And soon, like any engineering, every building is going to tick the right boxes. It's going to be saving so much energy. It's going to be using the right materials. But how do you do more? And I think that's only when you can touch the human heart. And that's when it's time for us to go back to our roots and look at what's made all of us different, and how do you put our identities across through a space, through a cultural space, through your cities and the way we live. So to me, that's more, it's going to be the challenge in the next 20 years for us to look back and make sure that we focus on these aspects and not lose out our cultural identities, because otherwise it's becoming a complete monochrome world. It's already the McDonaldization, as we call it, it's happening right across. So it's the regional identities that are very important.
Also the irony of making glass towers in Dubai and calling them LEED-rated buildings, which is absurd. So I completely agree with that. Absolutely. Batul, we'll give you the final word here, but we're going to take questions. I cannot believe that we are out of time, but we're going to open this up to questions really quickly. But before that, I would like to ask Batul, how do we go beyond ratings?
I think it's I'll speak as a museum planner, not as an architect. It is about making anything which is relevant to its context. So whether if you're placing something, as you said, in Dubai and making it as a glass tower, what's the local context? You may not have the right template for building high-story buildings, but you can still look at what can be adapted. And when as a museum planner, when you look at context, it's also the same thing in terms of storytelling. That what is the level of engagement you're providing, and if it is going to be engaging, your institution is going to be sustainable. It's not going to be a white elephant where you're going to be pushing school kids through halls where they're probably the only reason they come is their air-conditioned halls. But you want them to be there because they start getting excited, they can participate. There isn't an onslaught of too much of technology where they go brain dead after 10 minutes, but there is that balance which makes everything sustainable. And I'm just going to bring back that entire aspect of government agencies and the funding that's required to museums. While it seems like it's a very expensive proposition to build a great quality museum, the fact is that its economic trickle down for the entire region is so substantial, whether it's hotel room nights, it's tourists, it's small businesses, souvenir businesses, that automatically it may not necessarily become a Bilbao, but it will still mean that investment of a few hundred crores will completely revive that area if that museum works as a good engagement and goes beyond your usual 2D passive exhibits. So
and we don't necessarily want it to become a Bilbao, because that's also another trap, right? That's part of the kind of like Rahul said, the homogenization of museums, where we have lost this other imagination, this Dhaka War Museum capacity, of a museum. So thank you for that. So I'm going to take questions, and we've got a ton of questions here already. And unfortunately, we're not going to be able to go through all of them. But if I could request the panelists to keep it short so that we could answer more questions, that would be nice. And some are just quite factual, and some are asking questions like what is truth. So we may not be able to quite get through to do justice to all of them. But we have a question from Sanjay Mohanty, which is how do we integrate artificial intelligence technologies into museums to cope with the current digital age, and in turn to get students into museums and for them to participate and understand history? Any one of you?
I can take that. Thank you, Sanjay, for the question. There is a lot of artificial intelligence coming in terms of whether it's retina tracking, or whether it's also about the time you spend in front of an exhibit. And if you have scanned QR codes, it throws that information. The only challenge is finding a balance there, because if it becomes too much of that, then the student or the person who's looking at things decides to then stop looking at it. If there's it's the same concept as too much of notifications on our phones. So how do you to find that right balance and that right engagement? It is coming in. It's actually a very, very cost-effective technology if you do it right. And in today's time, it's also safer technology instead of giving handheld devices or headphones, because you don't have to worry about sanitization. People can carry their own phones and interact with museums, exhibits. You can create your own environments. You can walk through time. All of that is happening. The key is how do you find the balance? And the other thing is quality, because some of it can be so bad that you'll start feeling nauseous after 3 minutes. So it cannot be the lowest tender. It has to be a quality-based tender for anybody who's doing that.
I'm going to shamelessly combine three questions, and I see Asad's already here. But Asad, allow us just to sum this up, please. There's so much excitement with the questions and the chat, so I do want to be able to combine them into one here. So with Bihar or Patna, was there any documentation of oral history? That's a question by Harshit Babu in the making of this. Was oral history involved with the Bihar Museum? And then what initiatives can we take to integrate locals and train locals in making community inclusive museums, and thereby how do we increase footfall?
Okay, I'm going to take that again because the brief had been developed keeping the Patna Museum collection in mind, because some of that collection was moving into Bihar Museum, because Patna Museum had the collection was so vast that there wasn't the right amount of space given to its artifacts. So that collection gets divided between the Bihar Museum and Patna Museum, and the storyline goes covers some periods chronologically in the Bihar Museum, and some periods get covered in the Patna Museum. As far as participation from local groups, that is in the programming, and there is some level of training happening, but that's going to be a while, because the museum is opening in phases. Part of it opened in 2015, then 2017, 18. So it will take a while for the institution to be running in that manner. But that is something that has been envisaged. So.
Thank you again. Rahul, Ajay, Batul, last thoughts?
I'm good.
Yes, yes, Rahul. I thought you had something.
No, I said I'm good. I think it's a great initiative to take this further, and I think other governments need to look carefully at what's happened in Bihar. And we've got 29 states now, and I think each state deserves a good museum. Each state has its own story to tell, so we should really be looking at that.
Ajay, Batul. Ajay, there was a question about the ICA, which I saw you answered, but might be good to tell everyone.
I mean, I just sort of want to thank everyone on the panel. I think just to start with, this was really, I mean, for me, it was great learning. I hope I can sort of have further conversations with you all later just to understand this. But there's so much that I think we can think about in the context of using the museum, the concept of a museum as a forum to really educate and pass on information, especially as we sort of move into a largely uncertain future. So I'm hopeful that these conversations will actually lead us to those types of spaces. So thank you all.
Thank you again. Again, we are completely out of time. I would like to thank Avid Learning, CSMVS, and Asad Lalji for this incredible opportunity. I'm sure, Ajay, it was learning for you, but absolutely for all of us as well. So thank you again, and over to you, Asad.
Thank you, Sarosh, for so skillfully anchoring and moderating this session. You know, Avid's tagline is "Learning never stops." So this kind of revalidates that. Thank you to the panel. I mean, this was such an insightful session. You know, this all began last October. I had a meeting with Mr. Mukherjee, and we talked about certain areas where we could collaborate in. And suddenly he mentioned sustainability as one thing that they were doing at the museum. And I took that back and we proposed a series on sustainability, which was supposed to be an offline session at the visitor center in April. Starting in April, a series we had pitched, and obviously lockdown happened. And I'm delighted that we could manage to take the series online, and it's also fitting that our first live session was on sustainable architecture and urbanism, and we go full circle to food and now back to the Eco Museum. This is the concluding of our fourth edition. We've done over 25 programs in it under sustainability now, including videos and activations and these live sessions, master classes and workshops. But thank you so much, guys. It's been such a learning experience, even for me. A special thank you to the CSMVS for partnering with us, Mr. Mukherjee, Brinda, Urvashi, Joyati, and the rest of the team. Thank you to our participants for logging in. I know there's so much more things to do, and on a Saturday evening that you actually are spending your time with us, but thank you for being here. Stay tuned for more programs for Avid Online. Our next live session, we're giving next week a skip because of Diwali, is on design futures. It's on the 19th of November, followed by a session on creative collaborations on the 28th. To find out more, as I always tell people, just stalk us on social media at Avid Learning, or we'll stalk you, or check us out on our website at www.avidlearning.in. Until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, and remember that learning never stops. Thank you very much, and have a good night and the rest of the weekend.